Hey everyone, it's Tyler Valle, and today I want to talk about the Second Amendment and the purpose behind the phrase, right to keep and bear arms. With all that's been in the media lately, I feel like I need to put this video out now and strike while the iron is hot, while at the same time trying to be as informative as possible. Much like my video about the Articles of Confederation and free inhabitants, I want to make this video to help inform others by using Supreme Court cases and the words of the men who wrote the Constitution itself to help further elaborate on what the Second Amendment meant when it was written, and more importantly, what it means today. To be clear, I want to state up front that I am a supporter of the Second Amendment, and I came to this conclusion after nearly 15 years. Believe it or not, but being part of a political family does introduce you to a lot of concepts at an early age. One of those for me was gun rights and gun ownership. Now that doesn't mean that I was running around at like age 10 claiming that I understood the deeper connotations behind the Second Amendment, but it did become one of those things that I tried to reason with for most of my life. Today at age 25, I find myself in complete support of the Second Amendment, and often take stances against any form of further gun control. Now that doesn't mean that I'm against all forms of gun control, obviously, and I always think there's a healthy debate that can be had. So with that all out of the way, I think we can finally get into the video, but before I can even elaborate on my defense of the Second Amendment, let's make sure we all know what the Second Amendment is. The Second Amendment of the US Constitution is a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So let's break that down. What does it mean by a well-regulated militia, and why is it seen as necessary for the security of a free state? The answer can be found in both the Bill of Rights and American history. At the time the Constitution was being written, a freshly independent United States was still recovering from the wounds of their costly revolution. A conflict that was nearly 150 years in the making finally came to a head in 1775 when the first shots of the war rang out on April 19th. Now, just prior to the war, the British Parliament would pass 4 acts meant to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party, one of the largest examples of economic terrorism ever put on the books. In Britain, these were simply called the Cohesive Acts, as they were trying to coerce the colonists to play ball. But here in the colonies, they were called the Intolerable Acts. One of these acts was called the Quartering Act, an act that actually has multiple variations all with the same name, all used against the colonist. But this latest one would legally require colonists in America to offer room and board in inns, unoccupied homes, and political buildings to English troops. While this may not seem like an issue today, this was done at a time in which tensions between Great Britain and the colonies were about to reach their boiling point. Within under a year, we were going to be in full-scale war. The last thing that the colonists wanted were more English troops on American soil, there to enforce the will of Parliament upon them. The fighting began when English soldiers were sent to secure armories, stations in which ammunition and cannons were held for the militia. When the colonists heard that the British were coming, they sought to empty out the armories as fast as possible, and they had almost finished the job when the English soldiers actually arrived. Fighting in Lexington and Concord would begin on April 19th and only last for a few hours, but by the end of the fighting, 49 colonists had lost their lives to Great Britain's 73. Eventually, the British were forced into a retreat and the war was on. So with the memory of English troops still on the mind of the Founding Fathers and the government, they would enact 2 systems that would ensure that their liberties would never be infringed by the military again. Now the first was the Third Amendment. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. The second was more of an unofficial rule. It was kind of just the United States saying that it was going to avoid the creation of or expansion of a standing army that would exist during times of peace. Ironically, the Founding Fathers didn't believe that the United States would ever be involved in a foreign war or military invasion. Therefore, they wouldn't need a standing army and would instead rely on trained citizens who would rise together as a militia if a time were ever to arise where the United States was ever invaded. The benefit of such a system is that once the fighting was over, the militia could just go back to their normal lives as ordinary citizens. The founders were so scarred by the idea of having soldiers occupying their lives that they had actually opted not to create any more of their own. That was until the founders, or at least a large chunk of them, began a movement to expand the power of the federal government. You see, now the year is 1787, 12 years after the revolution began. The United States is freshly independent and just getting its footing, but it realizes it's held back by a weak document it created during the formation of its government. The Articles of Confederation are just too weak to support the entire system. It left the federal government with almost no power and gave far too much power to individual states, all of whom had different objectives in mind and didn't always get along. That's why the Constitutional Convention was called. Now, the original intent of the convention was to gather the smartest and most influential men in the country together to rewrite the Articles of Confederation so that they would actually work the way that they were intended to. However, almost immediately, the convention came to the conclusion that if they were to create a new document on which an entire government was going to operate, they needed to completely scrap the Articles of Confederation and just simply start over. So in secret, the men who would go on to be given the title the Framers would begin writing their first draft of the Constitution. Constitution. When the Constitution was finally made public and went out for a vote, it almost immediately split the country in half, and in a way created the first two American political parties, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, who would eventually go on to form the Democratic Republicans. Tensions almost immediately went from 1 to 100, with even other founding fathers like Patrick Henry calling for the execution of the framers for treason. Now, in order to get the Constitution ratified, most of the larger states needed to support it, and unfortunately, most of them did not. I mean, why would they want to give up their own power? Now, this didn't dissuade the framers though. They began a media tour of sorts to drum up support for their cause. Three of these men in particular, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, would begin writing anonymous essays that were published in papers in support of ratification. By the end, the three men had written a combined 85 essays in what we now call the Federalist Papers. So with this knowledge on hand, we can ask and answer the question, what does it mean to keep and bear arms? Two of the Federalist Paper essays touch on the topic of both the militia and the right of the people to own guns. The first is Federalist Paper number 29, written by Alexander Hamilton, and the second was Federalist Paper number 46, written by James Madison. Both mean to lay out what they believe to be the purpose behind the civilians' ownership of firearms, and the purpose that they serve to the public. This is extremely useful because there are unfortunately people who read the Second Amendment and attempt to reason that A. The Second Amendment only applies to muskets and cannons because that's what existed at the time the amendment was written. B. The Second Amendment should be reconsidered because if the Founding Fathers could see the weapons that we have today, they would not believe that civilians should be allowed to own them. And C, the Second Amendment only applies to members of a militia, and because we have a standing army now, the purpose of the militia is obsolete. Therefore, you don't get to keep your guns. I don't want to say that people who make these claims are lying, as I don't want to assume that they're being deliberately dishonest. Rather, I want to say that they're simply, misinformed. And to try to prove why I think that they're wrong, I want to attack each of these arguments individually. Argument 1. The Second Amendment should be reconsidered because if the Founding Fathers could see the weapons that we have today, they would not believe that civilians should be allowed to own them. First off, can I just say that I really hate this modern trend of people taking influential figures from the past and trying to use them to push their own political agendas? I personally think it's dishonest to say that you believe that men who penned essays claiming that they supported the right of the civilians to keep and bear arms to fight the government would actually be in favor of the government revoking that right. One must understand that the Founding Fathers established the Bill of Rights by vote. Each right had to be voted on by a committee. It started out as like 140 of them, and then it was whittled down to 10. Even without looking into their writings, this is why we can assume that they stood in support of the Second Amendment in its totality. By saying, without evidence, that they would support your opposing stance, to me sounds no more convincing than religious people who claim people like Christopher Hitchens converted on his deathbed. Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure what the Founding Fathers would think about the Second Amendment today, but we do know what they thought about it back then. In Federalist Paper number 29, Alexander Hamilton laid out his stance on the armed militia and the topic of gun ownership in a single paragraph. If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people, while there is a large body of citizens, little if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it if it should exist. Not only does Hamilton believe that a standing army's existence does not cease the need for a militia, but he also believed that the civilians should have the same weapons and training as the American military. He wanted to create a perfect line of defense against the possibility of the United States' own military being used to subjugate people. In my mind, this is a very clear example of unconditional support of the people to be armed. Hamilton both argued for the existence of a militia that had the training and weapons to resist a traditional army, be it American or foreign. Do you think that he would see a soldier today with a standard issued M4A1 carbine and think that that weapon should not be in the hands of the civilians in case the day were to come that the military is used to infringe on their rights? Or do you believe that he was simply arguing that whatever weapons were in the hands of the military should also be in the hands of the people? This also ties into argument number 2. The Second Amendment only applies to muskets and cannons because that's all that was available during the time in which the Second Amendment was written. This argument may be the most flawed argument that I've ever seen revolving around the concept of the Second Amendment. This is not an argument that is made only by young people either. I've seen this argument made by college-level professors making this point in their classrooms to students who may not know any better. This particular point doesn't require evidence to disprove it either, rather it can be broken down using a thought experiment. So let's just set aside the Second Amendment for a moment and take a look at the first. The First Amendment of the US Constitution states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. With this in mind, I gotta ask the question, does freedom of speech not apply to what you say on camera or on the phone or even online? As an American citizen, is your First Amendment right to peaceably assemble revoked the moment a camera is involved? I know to most of you, this question sounds ridiculous, and that's really because it is. Of course you do. If you didn't, there would be nothing stopping the government from stepping in with laws that can prosecute you for criticizing the government if it's caught on camera. If you do believe that the First Amendment applies to all of these mediums and spaces, but don't believe that the Second Amendment applies to modern day weapons, are you at least willing to acknowledge that your argument is inconsistent? I mean, if you wanted to be consistent, you just have to believe that the freedom of speech only applies to spoken word, handwritten letter, or what could be created by a 1700s era printing press. After all, that was all that was available at the time. The third argument that I want to address can actually be split into two pieces and be refuted with the same Federalist Papers that I mentioned earlier, as well as the Supreme Court. Argument 3 states, the Second Amendment only applies to members of a militia, and because we have a standing army now, the purpose of the militia is obsolete. Therefore, no militia, no guns. This seems to be the most common argument made against the Second Amendment that I can find. The belief that gun advocates are being disingenuous when they mention the right to keep and bear arms, but opt to not mention the well-regulated militia part. But to make sure that I don't skip over everything, I do want to break this down into two sections. So first, let's tackle the argument, because we have a standing army, the purpose of the militia is obsolete. What makes this claim true? It's a claim that I've seen made plenty of times. Hell, my college professor made this argument 3 times while talking about the Bill of Rights. Why does the existence of a standing army mean we no longer need a militia? The truth is, there's actually no connection there. I already read Federalist Paper number 29 earlier, in which Hamilton doubled down on the existence of a militia regardless of the existence of a standing army. And that's not all. When you combine his words with the words of James Madison's Federalist Paper number 46, it becomes crystal clear that the existence of a militia was supposed to be an absolute. It may well be doubted whether a militia, thus circumstance, could ever be conquered by such a proportion of regular troops. Those who are best acquainted with the last successful resistance of this country against the British arms will be most inclined to deny the possibility of it. Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition more insurmountable than any which simple government of any form can admit of. Both Madison and Hamilton not only supported the idea that militias were necessary for the protection of the United States, but Hamilton himself affirmed the existence of a standing army would in no way affect the necessity of a trained militia. I believe this shuts the door on the argument over militias, but it doesn't address the second half of the argument. Gun ownership is tied to being a member of a militia. If you're not a militiaman, you don't need a gun. And sadly for people who make this argument, it's irrelevant. But it's not just me who says that though. In 2008, the Supreme Court in the case District of Columbia v. Heller ruled in a vote of 5-4 that a bill passed in Washington, D.C. that banned the ownership of handguns and put extremely strict gun control laws on the books was unconstitutional. This court case would also set the precedent that the Second Amendment is protecting individuals' rights to keep and bear arms, and at no time was ever tied to the service of a militia. So even though militias may not exist today in the way that they did before, this has no bearing on the individual's ability to own guns. There isn't much more that I could add to this either. It was decided upon by the highest court in the country. Whether anyone agrees or not is irrelevant. Finally, the last thing that I want to discuss is the idea that there's no reason to create a system that attempts to counter the power of the military. Because one, there's no real chance that there's ever going to be a coup, and if there was, you wouldn't be able to resist it. I hate when I see people make these kinds of claims. Honestly, there's absolutely no reason to assume that we will never have a military coup in our country, because guess what? They're not actually that rare. Since 1980, only 30 years, there has been 69 successful or semi-successful coups around the world. That's just over 2 a year. This also doesn't take into consideration all of the failed coups that have taken place, which vastly outnumber that number of 69. I'm not saying that it's likely that we'll ever see a coup in this country, but there's absolutely no reason not to take the steps to prevent one from ever happening. As for whether or not a militia could ever put up any form of resistance against the military, let's just look back through our recent history. There are many examples over the course of the last several decades that disprove this very idea. If the United States military was completely unstoppable, why couldn't they stop the North Vietnamese, the North Koreans, or even the insurgents in the Middle East? The US military is amazing, there's no doubt about that. But even when they completely smash the infrastructure of a foreign country, there's still going to be insurgents who can and will resist them. Now, if the US can completely carpet bomb a nation in the Middle East and still face opposition, what would it be like for them fighting on their own soil where common sense would dictate that they want to cause the least amount of collateral damage? If the citizens were trained and armed, it would no doubt be a violent and horrific battle. Civil wars often are. But even if the military were to force the militias into hiding, they wouldn't be capable of establishing a long-term dictatorial peace over the US as long as the citizens were armed. Now you may say, oh, the military has tanks, jets, and drones, but you must understand that these are not tools used to occupy a territory. Those are tools used to destroy the land. If the military were to rely on such weapons, they would never be capable of establishing peace. You can't have tanks standing on every street corner to enforce your new government. You would need armed soldiers. Soldiers who would be armed with the same weapons as the civilians. That's all from me today. Once again, my name is Tyler Valle. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.